This is June 3rd, 1995, and this is a message that I made up some time ago, and now seems a good time to deliver it since we have Father's Day just around the corner. I have in time past spoken on this passage on Mother's Day because Hannah is such a good example of a mother, but also it has, as I was studying it for Mother's Day, why it seemed like it has a message to fathers too. And so with Father's Day coming up, I want to take this opportunity to give this message. Now the passage is in 1 Samuel, the early chapters. We won't read those because I'm taking it from a number of different chapters in 1 Samuel. But it has to do with Eli, who was, of course, not a good example of a father, but he presents a challenge to us as fathers because of his failure, whereas he could have been a great success, but just because of this one failure in his life, especially one outstanding failure, he not only failed, but he miserably failed. Now, I've called this, titled this message, Discipline is Decisive. And it certainly was in Eli's life, in his own self-discipline, and especially in his discipline of his children. Now we should look at the good qualities of Eli because he had a lot of them. He was a man who devoted himself to the house of God and to his duties in it. He was, of course, the priest, and we find him faithfully there in the house of God on every occasion when somebody comes there. Eli is there, and he was a gracious man. When he thought that Hannah was drunk, that day she came to the temple, or to the tabernacle. He spoke graciously to her when she denied that she was drunk. He said to her, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." And then later, when they came and brought Samuel, he said to Anna and Elkanah, her husband, "The Lord give you descendants from this woman for the loan that was meant to the Lord." And so he was a gracious man. And he worshipped the Lord, as it tells here. He worshipped with the family. And not only that, but he was Samuel's mentor for many years. Samuel looked to him for guidance, and Samuel evidently learned some bad things as well as some good things from him. He was submissive to God's discipline. When Samuel told him what was going to happen to him because of his failure, he says, "It is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him." And so he submitted to this terrible punishment that God inflicted upon him and his family. And he was concerned, even in the time of his death, he was concerned. The last thing, the most important thing that he was concerned about when the Philistines took the ark was he was concerned about the ark. And it says, in fact, that's when he heard about what happened to the ark, that it fell into the hands of the Philistines, that he fell off the seat backward by the side of the gate and his neck was broken. When he made mention of the ark of God, and the messenger made mention of that, then he fell over and died. Now, he served God for many years. It says that he judged Israel for 40 long years. And also he even reproved sin. When he thought Hannah was drunk, he reproved her, and he even reproved his sons in a sort of weak way. He did it, but at least he tried to reprove them. Now, what was it? He looks like he was certainly a good man, and he was. I'm sure we're going to find Eli in heaven. But he had a lot of good points. But he had a terrible, tragic failure. Now, this worked out, and his sons were, as it says in the second chapter, verse 12, now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. And so he had a terrible failure there in bringing up his sons. Now they were also greedy and gluttonous and selfish and violent. It says in the same chapter 2, that before they burned the fat, they were priests, of course, in the house of God. The priest servant would come and say to the man who sacrificed, give meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw. And if the man said to him, they should really burn the fat first, then you may take as much as your heart's desire. He said, he would then answer him, no, but you must give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. And not only that, but they were lustful. They committed terrible things right in the house of God. It says in verse 22, now Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Imagine what terrible goings on there were right there in the house of God. They were disobedient to their father when he reproved them for these things, and said to them, if one man sins against another, God will judge him, but if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father, because the Lord desired to kill them. And not only that, but they caused men to abhor the things of God. It says in verse 17, therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. And it's no wonder when they saw the priests carrying on like these men did. Now, what about Eli's dealing with his sons? Now, evidently he must have failed miserably in his early training of them, because as we meet them, they're young adults and they're such wicked people. Now Eli knew everything that they did. In that passage we just read, it said that. He heard everything his sons did to all Israel, and he says here, I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. And so it wasn't that he didn't know about what they were doing. He fully knew what they were doing, and he knew the spiritual damage they were doing to the people. You make the Lord's people transgress, he told them. And he knew that God's judgment would be severe, as he says, if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? But he did not restrain them. It says in chapter 3, verse 13, for I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. And then in chapter 2, verse 25, it says, they did not heed the voice of their father. Now, what was Eli's basic sin? We see that he had a lot of good points. We see he failed miserably here, but what was the basic thing that that was the matter with him. Now, in the first place, he had great privileges as a priest, and privilege always brings responsibility. And consequently, he was, as a man in such a position as he was in, that what happened to him and his family would be a great influence on the whole company of people. He was especially responsible to see to it that he and his family lived godly lives. But it says in verse 29 and 30 of chapter 2, it says, "Why do you kick at my sacrifice?" This is what the Lord said to him, "and my offering, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honor your sons more than me, to make yourselves fat with the best of all the offerings of Israel, my people." And then he goes on to say, "Therefore the Lord God of Israel says, I said indeed that your house and the house of your father would walk before me forever. But now the Lord says, far be it from me. For those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed." And so he not only despised the Lord's offering, but he despised the Lord in the way that he handled his sons, because he put them before the Lord. And not only that, but he put himself before the Lord, as we've seen here. He in verse 29 it says, "You make yourselves fat with the best of all the offerings," and we saw how the sons took the fat that was supposed to be offered of the Lord and took it away from the people and didn't let them offer it because they wanted it to eat. And evidently, Eli wanted it to eat too, as we see that when the day that he died and fell over, it said that he was very heavy. So evidently both he and his sons had their eyes upon these things that they wanted, these sacrifices that they wanted to eat, and instead of obeying the Lord and burning the fat, they saved it to eat it. And as God says, you're honoring your sons more than God. And so what was really his basic sin was that he was putting other things before God. He was putting himself before God. He was putting his sons before God. And here he, as the God's priest, was to be a leader to bring the people to God. And he was putting earthly things before heavenly things. Remember in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul talks about his own life as a man of God. And he says here, 1 Corinthians 9:25, he says, "And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified." Well, you see, that's Eli was in a similar position, and he didn't discipline his body, and he became disqualified. He didn't discipline his sons, his family either. And so it was a case of, as we said before, where discipline in his life, or lack of it, was decisive. Now, Eli's terrible punishment, as we saw, privilege brings greater responsibility, and so we may think, well, the Lord certainly was hard on Eli, but the reason is because he had such a great privilege. God had told him that his family was going to be before him forever, serving him. But then And because of his sin, the Lord revoked that promise and instead brought upon him a terrible punishment. Now, this punishment is given in chapter 2, verse 31. The days are coming that I will cut off your arm and the arm of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. And you will see an enemy in my habitation, despite all the good which God does for Israel. And there shall not be an old man in your house forever. And so his descendants are to die young. They were to grieve him. It says, but any of your men whom I do not cut off from my altar shall consume your eyes and grieve your heart. And all of the descendants of your house shall die in the flower of their age. And then he said that in verse 34, he says, now this shall be a sign to you that will come upon you. Your two sons on Hophni and Phinehas, in one day they shall die, both of them. And then he said that he was going to raise up, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before my anointed forever. And as it said in verse 13, his descendants are to be judged forever. The iniquity of his house, it says in chapter 3, verse 14, shall not be atoned for by sacrifice forever. Now that's a terrible judgment, and it was carried out. We know that Hophni and Phinehas died the day the ark was taken by the Philistines. And also we know that Eli's house was slaughtered and the one survivor removed from the priesthood. Now that is told us in chapter 22, verse 16. Chapter 22, verse 16 says, and the king, that is King Saul, said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech. Now Ahimelech was the great-grandson of Eli. And he was still serving God. God didn't bring this judgment upon him right away. He was still serving God as a priest. But now he is called before Saul, and he says, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. Then the king said to the guards who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. And so 85, including 86, including 85, I guess, including Ahimelech of the house of Eli, were killed that day. However, one of them escaped, named Abiathar. It says, now one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And he came and told David what happened, and David made him priest in his regime. And so Abiathar stayed in the priesthood. However, over in 1 Kings, it tells us that Abiathar, when David was old and had designed that Solomon to be king, Abiathar sided with Adonijah, another one of David's sons, instead of Solomon. And consequently, when Solomon became king, he removed Abiathar from the priesthood. It says in chapter 2 of 1 Kings, verse 26, and to Abiathar the priest the king said, go to Anathoth, to your own fields, for you are worthy of death. And so he removed him from being king, and he made Zadok the priest instead of Abiathar. Now Zadok was of another family of the priestly family of Aaron. Remember, Aaron had two sons, one named Eleazar, and Eli was of that branch of the family, and another one named Ithamar. And Zadok was a son of Ithamar, so the whole family of priests changed because of Eli's failure. And Zadok, it says in Ezekiel that Zadok's family is going to minister before Christ in the millennial temple. Just think it could have been Eli's family, but he was removed because of his idolatry, really, as a priest of God. Now, what lessons can we learn from the life of Eli? Well, we can learn that you can have many good qualities and still miserably fail if you put other things before God. And that certainly was true of Eli. He had so many things going for him, and it was just all the more tragic that he failed so miserably in this one particular area of disciplining himself and his family in order to put God first. You see, he was putting himself and his family before God in this lack of discipline. And the lessons we see here for fathers are that fathers have a great privilege and grave responsibility in being head of your house. And you need to take this responsibility very, very seriously, because God's going to hold you responsible. He's given you a great privilege of leading your house and being the head of your house. And you've got to take that responsibility very seriously and put God first in your house and before your family. Now, you need to start training your children early in order to do this, because when they get to be young adults, as we see with Eli, it's often too late to do anything for them. Their character has been formed already, and you need to see to it that the character of your children is formed early in life. And you need to seek to please the Lord, not other people or yourself or your children in your training of them. That's especially important, as we see here. That if only Eli had put the Lord first, and instead of himself and his children first, then the whole situation would have been much different. And he would have ended up with a family that pleased God, and his family could have gone on in service of the Lord in the high office of priesthood. Now, another thing that's obvious here is that you need to make your children obey. Now, this is God's number one command to children, and that is that they obey their fathers and their mothers. And the fathers especially are responsible before God to see that they do it. Now, you can't, as fathers, you can't shunt that responsibility off on somebody else, not even to the mother. It's the responsibility of the father, and it's going to be the father that God calls before him to answer for this, that your children must be made to obey. And they can be, because God gives them to you at an age in which you can just see to it that they obey, that you've got to, that's absolutely your responsibility to see that they obey. And even if they're strong-willed and hard to manage, still you can see to it that they obey. When they see to it that you've got fire in your eyes about this matter of obedience, they're going to obey you. They're going to give in. Your children will not stand up against you if you absolutely insist that they obey. And you will have it no other way. You will have your way, and they will not have their way. It depends upon the strength of your will and your own discipline. And see that they form the habit of obedience. It's not just a kind of a one-time thing that they obey you in this or that, but that it's absolutely a habit for them. That when you tell them to do something, they do it. And they don't give you a bad time about it. That they learn over a considerable period of time that when you tell them to do something, you mean it, and you're going to stand by it, and you're not going to have anything else, and so it's no use of them even trying. That they found from experience that it's not worth it to try. That you're going to have your way, and they're not going to have their way. And that's exactly what God expects you to do, because He has given one great commandment to children, and that is that they obey their parents. And the fathers need to see that the children obey the mother too, just as much as to obey the father. That's part of obeying the father, is to obey the mother too. Now, in this determining and causing the children to obey, God advises that you use the rod to help you in your task. And He's a safer guide than the psychologists are. So it certainly behooves a father to follow the Lord's advice rather than somebody else's. And if you do it right, if you use the rod so that you really cause the child to not want to face it, a spanking should be such an ordeal for the child that they just don't want to face it. I mean, if a spanking is something that just makes the children mad, then it has lost its purpose. In fact, it's going to be used against you instead of for you. It's got to be something that breaks the child's will, that they just don't want to face that ordeal. It's got to hurt them enough to do that. And only you can, by experiment, can tell how to do that. But you've got to make spanking an ordeal that they just don't want to face under any circumstances. And look up those references in Proverbs. There's 1, 2, Proverbs 13, 24, 22, 15, 23, 13, and 14, and 29, 15. But you can use a concordance to find those, to see what God says about using the use of the rod to bring obedience to your children. Now, a good disciplinarian, which is your calling, must first discipline himself. As we see, that was Eli's problem too, or part of his problem was he didn't discipline himself very much. And in some ways he did, but in other ways he didn't. And this is something that happens so often, that fathers that don't discipline themselves, they will not discipline their children either. They're soft on themselves, so they'll be soft on their kids. Now you've got to be hard on yourself, or disciplinary with yourself, in order to be disciplinary with your kids. And the one thing just opens the door to the other. Now, your success or failure will bring praise or reproach upon God's name, as it did in the case of Eli. It's going to do in your case, because people are going to see what your kids turn out to be, and that's going to be, they're going to be out there in the world every day having a testimony either for or against the Lord. And that's a wonderful opportunity, but it's also a tremendous awesome responsibility, because they can be a testimony every day against the Lord instead of for Him. And it's a shame that we know, even in our own experience, of many cases where this is happening. Now, your success or failure will also help or hinder others who you influence. For instance, there's a terrible scripture over here in 1 Samuel 8, 4 and 5. This is about Samuel. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make for us a king to judge us, like all the nations. Now notice what they said, Your sons do not walk in your ways, Samuel. Now Samuel had a daily example before him of a father in Eli, and of his sons Hophni and Phinehas, how he raised them. And evidently, Samuel was more influenced by Eli's example as a father than by his own parents, because he lived with Eli longer during his formative years. And so consequently he wound up being a failure as a father too. And this is something that can happen to your children too, and to people that observe you as a father. Are they going to be helped in their office as of fatherhood, or are they going to be hindered by your example? Well, this is some of my thoughts as I consider the life of Eli, and I commend them to you, that you will sit down with the Word of God and just see what the Lord speaks to you about this man's example.